There is a question that has troubled believers and non-believers for centuries. A question that sounds simple, but strikes at the core of the human condition. If God exists, why isn't he obvious? Why do so many people say they can't see him, can't hear him, can't feel him? Some call this divine hiddenness, the idea that a loving God should be more visible, more undeniable, more immediate. The philosopher J. L. Schellenberg made this argument famous. A perfectly loving God would never allow non-resistant unbelief. If someone sincerely wants a relationship with God, yet remains unaware of him, that means God either doesn't exist, or isn't loving. It sounds sharp, emotionally compelling, even devastating. But only at first glance. Because behind the force of that argument lies an assumption so large, so unexamined, that the whole case collapses the moment we expose it. The assumption is this: if God loves us, he must make himself constantly obvious. But this assumption is built on a view of God that treats him like a physical object, something you detect with your eyes. Like a mountain or a lamppost, rather than a transcendent personal being whose purpose is not to overpower our senses, but to win our freely given love. So today, I want to turn this entire discussion upside down. I want to show you that divine hiddenness is not evidence against God's existence, but evidence for God's respect for human freedom, human dignity, and human moral agency. And even more, that God is not nearly as hidden as people assume. The real issue is far more uncomfortable. Human perception is not neutral. Humans do not look for God the way they look for their lost keys. This video will challenge the idea that God is absent, and replace it with the idea that God is quiet, subtle, and present in a way that calls for humility rather than control. So let's begin with something important. Divine hiddenness is not a modern problem. It is ancient. The people of the Bible cried out about it constantly. The prophet Isaiah declared, "Truly, you are a God who hides himself." The Psalms echo this everywhere. Why do you hide your face? How long, O Lord, will you remain silent? My God, why are you so far from my cry? If divine hiddenness disproved God, the Hebrew scriptures would have died on day one. Instead, the people who felt God's hiddenness were the same people who testified that God was deeply real, deeply personal, and deeply involved in human life. So divine hiddenness is not a contradiction in the biblical worldview. It is part of the story. A feature, not a bug. But why? Why would God choose to remain unseen? To answer that, we have to talk about human perception, not God's absence, but our limitations. Not divine silence, but human noise. Psychology teaches us something uncomfortable. Human beings routinely fail to notice what is right in front of them. You've seen the famous experiment. A man in a gorilla suit walks through a scene, and half the viewers don't notice because they're focused on counting basketball passes. This is called inattentional blindness. We do not see things we are not looking for. And when it comes to God, this matters. Because most people do not approach the question of God neutrally. Not emotionally. Not morally. Not socially. Not spiritually. Humans are not scientific instruments collecting pure data. We are creatures of desire, fear, pride, wounds, and bias. And nothing biases us more than the thought of God. God's existence threatens our autonomy. It confronts our moral choices. It challenges our lifestyle. It forces us to admit that life is not centered on us. This means something radical. Many people are not neutral non-believers. Many are motivated not to find God. Often unconsciously. Often sincerely. Often through layers of trauma, disappointment, anger, or misunderstanding. Schellenberg's argument assumes there exist countless people who are completely open, completely willing, completely receptive, yet God hides himself anyway. But do such people really exist? Or is the human heart far more conflicted, far more guarded, and far more selective than we dare to admit? This is where divine hiddenness gets real. It's not just a philosophical puzzle. It's a mirror. And when we look into that mirror, we discover that maybe the question is not, why is God hidden? But, why are humans so resistant to seeing him? Let's dive deeper into the heart of this problem, Because if we want to understand divine hiddenness, we must first understand something far more difficult: the selective nature of human perception. Human beings are not passive observers of reality. We filter reality. We interpret it. We shape it in the image of our expectations, our fears, our desires, and our worldview. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, the tendency to see what we want to see and ignore what we don't. Applied to God, this becomes explosive. Because if there is anything in the universe people have strong motivations to avoid, reinterpret, or suppress, it is the idea of a morally authoritative, omniscient, personal God. A God who sees everything. A God who commands virtue. A God who calls us to holiness. That God is not neutral information. He is a challenge to our autonomy. So the first major counterargument to divine hiddenness is this. 1. Human perception is not neutral. The human heart is not unbiased. Schellenberg's argument hinges on the idea that there are people who are sincerely open to God yet cannot find Him. But is openness really as simple as saying, if God is there, He can show Himself? No. Because openness is not a statement, openness is a disposition. A posture of the heart. A willingness not just to acknowledge God's existence, but to surrender to the implications of God's existence. And that is something far rarer than skeptics admit. Many people claim they would believe if God revealed Himself. But would they submit? Would they trust? Would they repent? Would they reorder their lives around Him? The mind may say, I am open. But the soul often whispers, not yet. The will often insists, on my terms. So when someone says, I can't see God, we must ask, is the problem the absence of light, or the preference for darkness? This is not an insult. It is the universal human struggle. Every believer knows this. Every person of faith has moments where they want God, but not too much of Him. Where they want comfort, not transformation. Where they want assurance, without obedience. If this is true even for believers, how much more does it affect those unsure about God in the first place? So the idea of countless, non-resistant unbelievers, quietly waiting for God to knock on their door collapses under psychological reality. Most disbelief is not fully resistant. But neither is it fully open. It is conflicted disbelief. Wounded disbelief. Autonomous disbelief. Distracted disbelief. And that is precisely the kind of world where a quiet, non-coercive God makes sense. But there's another, even stronger point. 2. The expectation that God must be obvious is a category mistake. The divine hiddenness argument treats God like a material object whose existence should be verified the way we verify the existence of an elephant or a lamppost. But God is not a physical entity in spacetime. God is not an object within the universe. God is the ground of being itself, the one through whom the universe exists. So asking, why doesn't God appear physically, is like asking, why doesn't the author appear as a character inside the novel? Or, why can't electricity be seen directly? Or, why can't the laws of logic be photographed? Just because something cannot be seen with the eyes does not mean it is hidden, absent, or non-existent. Much of what we treat as foundational reality is invisible. Consciousness, morality, beauty, meaning, mathematics, the law of non-contradiction, human dignity, love. If visibility determined existence, then the most real things in the human experience would be illusions. So the divine hiddenness argument is based on the wrong expectation. It demands empirical visibility from a metaphysical being. It treats God as detectable by the same tools we use to detect bacteria. That is a category mistake, a philosophical error. And ironically, if God were visible in the brute, empirical sense, undeniable, overwhelming, inescapable, Schellenberg's argument would be destroyed in another way. Because God's overwhelming visibility would annihilate human freedom. If God's presence were as undeniable as gravity, humans would no longer be free in the moral sense. You would obey Him not because you love Him, but because His existence is a psychological sledgehammer. There would be no atheists. But there would also be no love. There would be no rebellion. but there would be no genuine virtue. A world where God is completely visible would be a world where every moral decision is made with the spiritual equivalent of a gun to your head. You would behave, but you would not be free. And a God who desires a relationship of love, trust, and personal sincerity cannot force you into it by overwhelming your senses. So we arrive at a crucial insight. God is not hidden because he is absent. God is hidden because he refuses to coerce. He chooses to be discoverable, not undeniable. He offers hints, not domination. Clarity, not coercion. Invitation, not invasion. And that leads to the next stage of the argument, the reason God allows ambiguity. The reason God allows seeking. The reason he appears only to the humble. If we want to understand why God allows ambiguity, we must confront something at the very heart of the human person, freedom. Not freedom in the political sense. Not freedom of opinion. But freedom of the will, the deepest kind of freedom. The freedom to choose or reject love. Because if God is real, then what he wants most is not forced allegiance, but a relationship of trust, surrender, and love. And a relationship like that cannot happen under compulsion. If God revealed himself with the same force as the sun, then the human response would not be love, it would be survival. It would not be trust, it would be terror. It would not be obedience, it would be self-preservation. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard illustrated this with a brilliant analogy. If a king wants a peasant girl to love him, he could abduct her, dress her in gold, and force her into the palace. But the result would not be love, it would be domination. If he wants love, the king must disguise himself, lower himself, approach her in humility, not overwhelm her with his majesty. In the same way, if God wants love, he cannot crush us with the weight of his presence. He must reveal himself quietly, gently, humbly. Not to coerce, but to invite. And this leads to one of the most important insights in apologetics. 3. God's hiddenness is not the absence of love, it is the condition of love. To love God freely, you must be able not to love him. To trust God freely, you must be able to doubt him. To seek God genuinely, you must be able to ignore him. This world is built precisely for that freedom, with enough clarity for the humble to find God, and enough ambiguity for the proud to avoid him. Not because God is cruel, but because every act of love requires two things simultaneously. 1. Enough evidence to make love reasonable. 2. Enough freedom to make love meaningful. So God reveals himself in ways that do not overwhelm. Through conscience. Through beauty. Through the moral law. Through the longing of the human heart. Through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Through the quiet, steady voice that whispers, "Come to me." Yet all of this can be resisted. Not because God is hiding, but because he speaks in a language the proud do not want to hear. Let's go even deeper. 4. The world contains just enough clarity for seekers and plenty of escape routes for avoiders. This is the uncomfortable truth at the center of divine hiddenness. God does not overwhelm human beings with undeniable proof, but he also does not leave us without evidence. Instead, he calibrates the world in such a way that your response reveals your heart. Every person interprets the same universe differently. A believer looks at the stars and sees design. A skeptic sees random chance. A believer hears the moral law and senses the voice of a lawgiver. A skeptic hears evolutionary instinct. A believer sees purpose and suffering. A skeptic sees chaos. The same evidence is present to both, the question is the lens. If God wanted to remain hidden from those who reject him, he would not need to hide himself. He would only need to reveal himself in ways that require humility to perceive. And that is exactly what he does. He gives the world enough light for the sincere, but never enough to force the insincere. Jesus himself said this directly. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Not the proud. Not the self-sufficient. Not the autonomous. The pure in heart, not merely the pure in logic. So the divine hiddenness argument collapses on this point. It assumes God should reveal himself to everyone equally. But that would contradict the purpose of divine revelation. God reveals himself proportionally to the openness of the heart. This is not favoritism. It is simply the nature of relationship. A person who longs for God will find him everywhere, in beauty, in truth, in conscience, in suffering, in prayer. A person who wants autonomy more than truth will explain everything away. Both responses are allowed. Both responses are meaningful. Both responses are part of the story God is telling. Divine hiddenness is not an indictment of God's character. It is a safeguard for human dignity. Because a God who forces himself upon you violates the very freedom that makes love possible. Now we arrive at one of the most important sections of the entire argument, the false assumptions behind the divine hiddenness objection. Because the hiddenness argument only feels powerful if we assume certain things about God. Once those assumptions are exposed, the argument loses its force. Let's break down the three biggest ones. False assumption number 1. If God loves us, he would make his existence undeniable, asterisk. This assumption sounds intuitive. After all, if you love someone, don't you want them to know it? So if God exists, and if he truly loves every human being, why doesn't he simply reveal himself with overwhelming clarity? A booming voice from the sky. A fire that writes his name. A miracle on command. Surely that would end unbelief forever. But here's the problem. Overwhelming clarity does not produce love. It produces compliance. It produces fear. It produces submission. It produces external obedience, but it destroys inner freedom. Imagine a God who appears visibly every morning at sunrise, radiating unbearable splendor. No one would doubt his existence. But no one would be morally free in the deepest sense. You wouldn't pray because you love him. You would pray because you're terrified not to. You wouldn't obey because you trust him. You would obey because disobedience would be insane. Human freedom would be annihilated. And with freedom, love would die. So a loving God must remain discoverable, not undeniable. He must reveal enough to draw love, but not enough to force it. This is not a flaw in God's love. It is the very shape of his love. False assumption #2. There exist many people who are genuinely open to God but cannot find him, asterisk. This is the emotional center of Schellenberg's argument. The so-called non-resistant unbelievers. People who would love God if only they knew he existed, but God unfairly withholds himself. It sounds compassionate. It sounds humane. But does such a category exist in the real world? Are humans really so psychologically neutral? Let's test the idea. To be a non-resistant unbeliever, a person must be emotionally open to God, morally open to God, intellectually open to God, spiritually open to God, socially open to belief, personally willing to obey God, genuinely unafraid of the implications of God, free of pride, trauma, resentment, or misrepresentation, sincerely ready for relationship, repentance, and surrender. Is that common? Is that even realistic? Human beings are complicated. We are shaped by wounds, desires, moral struggles, trauma, family history, culture, pride, fear, misinformation, and personal autonomy. To claim that many people are open to God in a perfectly pure, neutral sense is to claim something deeply at odds with human psychology. Even believers, devoted, practicing believers, struggle with openness. Even the saints cried out, "Remove my heart of stone. I believe, help my unbelief." If people who already know God struggle to be open to him, how much more those who doubt his existence? The truth is this. Most unbelief is not fully resistant, but neither is it fully open. It is mixed. It is conflicted. It is wounded. It is prideful. It is fearful. It is distracted. To build an argument on the idea of perfectly open non-believers is to build an argument on a psychological fantasy. False assumption number 3. If God is real, evidence of him should be like evidence of physical objects, asterisk. This assumption reveals the deepest misunderstanding of all. It expects God to be visible the way a tree is visible, detectable the way a planet is detectable, empirically verifiable the way a chemical reaction is verifiable. But God is not an object in the universe. God is the ground of the universe. He is not a being among beings. He is being itself, the one through whom everything else exists. Demanding physical proof of God is like demanding laboratory proof of meaning, beauty, justice, consciousness, or love. When atheists say, "If God exists, why can't I see him?" they are treating God as a material object, a cosmic animal, a super-powered creature. But Christians do not believe in a physical sky god perched on a cloud. We believe in the creator of all matter, space, and time. And if God revealed himself in the purely material way skeptics demand, then he would cease to be the kind of God who invites spiritual relationship, and instead become a scientific specimen. A God who can be captured under a microscope is not God. A God who must obey our epistemic demands is not God. A God who exists only if we approve the evidence is not God. So the divine hiddenness argument collapses again, this time because it asks God to reveal himself in a way that contradicts his very nature. These three assumptions are the pillars of the hiddenness argument. And once they fall, the argument has nothing left to stand on. Next, we'll strengthen this further, because the strongest counterpunch to divine hiddenness is still ahead. God is hidden to the proud, but revealed to the humble. Now we come to the most explosive part of this investigation. Because after we dismantle the assumptions behind the hiddenness argument, we're left with a far more uncomfortable, and far more biblical, explanation. God is hidden to the proud, but revealed to the humble. This is not an insult. This is not a moral superiority claim. This is simply a spiritual law woven into the very fabric of reality. Jesus stated it plainly. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Not the brilliant, not the sophisticated, not the intellectually elite, not the experts in philosophy. The pure in heart. Meaning, the condition of the heart determines the clarity of the vision. This is the turning point where the divine hiddenness argument collapses entirely, because it assumes that spiritual perception, moral disposition, emotional wounds, and the condition of the soul are irrelevant to seeing God. But they are not irrelevant. They are central. Let's break this down. The proud do not lack evidence, they lack willingness. A proud heart says, "I'll believe if God meets my conditions. If God exists, he must reveal himself on my terms. God should adjust to my standards of proof." But God is not a laboratory sample that responds to commands. God is not a philosophical puzzle piece. God is not a cosmic butler obligated to satisfy your epistemic preferences. A proud heart approaches God as a judge, not a seeker. As an evaluator, not a lover. As an authority over God, not under God. And here is the spiritual reality. You cannot see the God you refuse to kneel before. Not because God is playing hide and seek, but because pride blinds the soul. This is why the Bible repeatedly warns. God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. He reveals himself to the lowly. He lifts up the meek. It's not favoritism. It's the structure of spiritual vision. The humble do not have more evidence, they have clearer sight. Humility does not mean weakness. It does not mean blind faith. It does not mean shutting off your brain. Humility means openness. It means the willingness to be led. It means the courage to surrender. It means a heart uncluttered by arrogance, fear, or self-worship. A humble person does not demand that God submit to them. They are willing to let God be God. And when that posture is present, something astonishing happens. The evidence of God becomes luminous. The moral law becomes a voice. Beauty becomes a window. The longing for meaning becomes a clue. The ache for eternity becomes a signpost. The conscience becomes a compass. The person of Jesus Christ becomes unavoidable. The humble see God not because they are naive, but because they are not blinded by pride. This is why two people can experience the same world, the same evidence, the same history, the same universe, and come to opposite conclusions. The difference is not the data. The difference is the heart. The universe is calibrated for seekers, not spectators. Some people say, if God exists, why doesn't he leave a trail of miracles everywhere? But what if the universe is already full of miracles? And the only difference is whether you have eyes to see them? You see, a world that shouts God's existence would destroy freedom. A world that hides God's existence would destroy relationship. So God created a world balanced on a razor's edge. Enough clarity for the seeker. Enough ambiguity for the avoider. This is not accidental. This is intentional. This is design. It is the perfect environment for love. And this destroys the core objection of divine hiddenness. God does not reveal himself equally because humans are not equally open. This is not a flaw in God, it is the consequence of freedom. A consequence of dignity. A consequence of the kind of relationship God desires. God is not hidden like an absent God. God is hidden like a lover who whispers. He is not a tyrant who shouts over the noise of your desires. He is a gentle presence who waits for your willingness. He is not coercive. He is not manipulative. He is not oppressive. He is patient. He is subtle. He is intimate. And he reveals himself in the ways that matter most. Not in fireworks. Not in cosmic billboards. Not in forced displays of power. But in the quiet places. In the humble spaces. In the yearning of the soul. In the still, small voice that speaks to those who are willing to hear. This is why divine hiddenness is not evidence against God. It is evidence of his character. A God who forces belief is a tyrant. A God who withdraws is indifferent. But a God who invites. Who calls. Who whispers. Who allows himself to be found only by the seeker. That is a God of love. At this point, we've addressed the psychological, philosophical, and moral dimensions of divine hiddenness. We've dismantled the assumptions behind the problem. We've exposed the bias behind human perception. We've shown that overwhelming revelation would destroy freedom. And we've demonstrated that God reveals himself proportionally to the openness of the heart. But there is still one more layer to uncover, the deepest layer. Because if God is real, and if he is love, then his hiddenness must serve a purpose more profound than simply preserving human autonomy. It must reveal something about who God is. And that leads us to the final, decisive insight. 5. God's hiddenness is part of his humility. It is not simply a strategy. It is not simply a concession to freedom. It is not simply a philosophical necessity. It is a revelation of his character. Let me explain. If God is love, then God must be humble. Love that is not humble is not love, it's domination. Love that demands attention is not love, it's narcissism. Love that overwhelms is not love, it's control. If God is love, then he must reveal himself in a way consistent with the nature of love. And love chooses invitation over coercion. That's why God speaks in whispers. That's why he nudges instead of forcing. That's why he unveils himself through conscience, beauty, meaning, moral truth, and the person of Christ, all of which can be resisted, misunderstood, or ignored. God's hiddenness is simply the humility of God expressing itself through the structure of reality. This is why the incarnation is so radical. When God became human, he did not come as a blinding force of glory. He came as a baby. Vulnerable. Poor. Unimpressive. Overlooked. The same God who could have arrived as an undeniable cosmic king chose instead to be born in a feeding trough. The same God who could have silenced all atheism chose instead to walk among fishermen, tax collectors, and outcasts. The same God who could have obliterated doubt with a gesture chose to teach through parables, stories that revealed truth only to those willing to receive it. Divine hiddenness is not a modern puzzle. It is the story of God from the beginning. God's hiddenness is actually God's gentleness. Think of all the ways God could reveal himself. He could appear in the sky every morning. He could carve his name into every mountain. He could stamp, made by God, on every atom. He could disintegrate atheism in an instant. But what would that accomplish? Nothing that matters. Nothing related to love. Nothing related to relationship. Nothing related to the transformation of the heart. It would solve the intellectual question, and destroy the soul. God's hiddenness is not because he is distant. It is because his goal is not to shock you into belief. but to shape you into love. And love requires freedom. And freedom requires humility. And humility requires space, the very space divine hiddenness provides. And now we reach the final turning point. God is not as hidden as people say. When skeptics speak of divine hiddenness, they often mean, I don't feel God. I don't see miracles. I don't hear His voice. But what if God is already speaking through the hunger for meaning, the ache for justice, the experience of beauty, the moral law written on every heart, the longing for eternity, the universal human desire for love, the historical reality of Jesus Christ, the testimony of billions transformed, the persistence of conscience, the unkillable sense that life is more than matter, the inability of atheism to satisfy the deepest human questions. What if God is not hidden, but we are distracted? What if God is not silent, but we are drowning in noise? What if God is not absent, but we have trained ourselves to expect Him only in the spectacular, while He waits for us in the ordinary? Maybe the real problem is not lack of evidence, but lack of attention. Not lack of revelation, but lack of receptivity. Not divine hiddenness, but human hurriedness. In that case, the question changes from, why doesn't God reveal Himself? To, why do we resist looking? And that is the heart of the entire apologetic. God is not hidden like a coward who flees. God is hidden like an artist whose signature you see only when you step back. God is hidden like a lover whose whisper you hear only when you quiet the world. God is hidden like a king who disguises himself so that his people might freely choose him. Divine hiddenness is not divine absence. It is divine love in its most delicate form. We've reached the end of this journey, a journey through philosophy, psychology, theology, and the interior landscape of the human heart. And now we can finally bring all the threads together to answer the question: is God hidden? Or are we not looking? Let's summarize the entire argument in its clearest form. 1. God is not hidden in the way skeptics assume. The hiddenness argument imagines that if God exists, He should behave like a physical object, visible, measurable, detectable, undeniable. But God is not a material object. He is not a creature inside the universe. He is the foundation of being itself. Demanding that God reveal Himself like a star or a chair is like demanding that consciousness be put in a test tube, or that justice be weighed on a scale. The expectation is misguided at the root. 2. Human perception is not neutral. We are not blank slates observing pure data. We are shaped by fear, pride, wounds, desires, culture, and worldview. The existence of God threatens our autonomy, our moral preferences, and our sense of self-sovereignty. So the idea that large numbers of people are completely open, perfectly unbiased, and ready for relationship, yet unable to find God, is psychologically unrealistic. Most unbelief is not non-resistant. It is conflicted. It is wounded. It is prideful. It is distracted. It is human. This doesn't make unbelievers bad. It makes them honest examples of what all humans struggle with: the tension between wanting truth and wanting control. 3. Overwhelming revelation would destroy freedom. If God revealed Himself in an undeniable, empirical, terrifyingly obvious way, human freedom would be gone. You would believe, not because you love God, but because denying Him would be impossible. You would obey, not because of moral transformation, but because of psychological coercion. You would follow, not because of trust, but because of fear. That kind of world could not sustain love, relationship, or virtue. A loving God must allow ambiguity. Not to hide Himself, but to protect our freedom. 4. God reveals Himself proportionally to openness. This is the spiritual law embedded in every religious tradition. The humble see God. The proud do not. Why? Because humility is openness. It is the willingness to listen, to receive, to surrender, to let God be God. A proud heart demands evidence on its own terms. A humble heart asks for truth on God's terms. And God's terms are always relational, not merely informational. Transformational, not merely intellectual. God is not a puzzle to be solved. He is a person to be loved. And relationships do not thrive under coercion, they thrive under freedom and mutual openness. 5. God's hiddenness is part of his humility, not his absence. A God who overwhelms is a tyrant. A God who withdraws is indifferent. But a God who whispers. A God who invites. A God who calls. A God who allows himself to be resisted. That is a God of love. The entire story of Christianity is built on a God who refuses to impose himself by force. He came not as a warrior, but as a child. Not on a throne, but in a manger. Not with armies, but with parables. Not with domination, but with a cross. The hidden God of philosophy is the humble God of the Gospels. ***6. God is not hidden, God is subtle. And subtlety is the language of love. You will not find God in fireworks. But you will find him in beauty. You will not find him in spectacle. But you will find him in the longing for meaning. You may not hear him shout. But you will hear him in conscience. You may not see him split the skies. But you will see him in the moral structure of reality. You may not feel him every moment. But you will sense him when you kneel in truth and humility. Divine hiddenness is not an argument against God. It is the very environment that makes authentic relationship possible. So the final answer is this. God is not hidden because he is absent. God is hidden because his goal is not to overwhelm you, but to invite you. He hides not like a God who runs from humans, but like a God who wants humans to approach freely. He hides not to conceal truth, but to reveal love. He hides not because he is distant, but because he is close enough to whisper. The problem of divine hiddenness is not that God refuses to show himself. The problem is that God refuses to show himself in a way that would invalidate the very thing he wants with you. A free, loving, authentic relationship. In the end, the question we must ask is not, where is God? But, where am I looking? And even more importantly, am I willing to see him? Because the moment the heart becomes humble, the moment the soul becomes quiet, the moment the will becomes open, God ceases to be hidden. And the seeker realizes something astonishing. God was never missing. We were.